First thing up is the approval of the fiscal year 27 administrative budget request. Ms. Higgins.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, good to see you. And thanks for being here. That is correct. This is the approval of the budget, or the request for approval of the administrative budget, which should be behind tab D, I believe. And as you'll see here, it's an approach to requesting the budget similar to what we've had in years past. It's actually a request that will be a decrease of approximately $2.7 million less than what will be the prior year budget once we cross into the next fiscal year. And in many ways, it's the same approach as we've used before for most cost categories, referring to just a base, kind of a baseline request with most of the cost categories remaining the same. There are two main differences in the budget request. One is to back out the great majority and/or the spending authority for Tier 5 implementation. And if you flip to a couple pages over that looks like more like a spreadsheet in the bottom right, you'll see that the full $200,000 in additional state money that was intended to be a one-time startup type funding, which we appreciate, is backed out. And then the great majority of the other potential special funds or other special fund spending authority is backed out as well for Tier 5. So you see the decrease there due to that. The other change is requesting some additional money for elevator updates and maintenance. Our elevators, as we understand it, in both the building and the parking deck are older and getting toward the end of their useful life. And a lot of the parts and repairs and things needed for that are becoming obsolete. So it's recommended that they be updated, so I wanted to include money for that. And those are really the two main changes, which nets out to a decrease of the approximate $2.7 million, and the other cost categories are basically just carried forward. And just as a reminder for all of that, we essentially fund ourselves with the, I guess, the other special funds. And should we get, we go through the budget process, but should we not spend all of our money, it essentially remains in the trust, all similar to past years. So I have one more thing to add later, but want to pause and ask if you have any questions, but otherwise would like to ask for your approval of the budget request.
Are we going to have any more carpet replacement? It looks good. I just want you to know, I made the comment to the vetter yesterday. I thought that that upgrade looks good.
Well,
thank you. Have any more aesthetic sort of things like that that's going to be occurring in this next year that's in the budget?
Well, thank you so much for that, and really appreciate that. And not in a material way. There's a few, I think from memory, a few minor things that still need to be done. I think there's part of the lobby that needs to be done, maybe some things that were purposely delayed to the end and the final parts of the project. But for all intents and purposes, we're finished. Melanie, is that right? Yeah, so a couple of small things, but this was the last floor.
I'd make a motion to approve.
We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
Any other discussion? All in favor, by aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you. And then one additional item I just wanted to mention to you that's a little different. You may remember that historically, for whatever reason, we've come to the board for the budget approval twice. We would do it in June typically, and then come back and do it again in August. And I know some of that has to do with the timing of when the submission is due to ELBO. But I really am not aware of any reason to come back in August. I think maybe in years past, as that was being put together, there was a reason to get an updated report from SBB or something of that nature. But the way things work now, we don't really have any reason. We don't plan on changing the budget request. And certainly if we were to make substantial changes, then that would be different. But absent any changes, we don't really see the need and don't intend to come back to you in August. But that's different, so I wanted to make sure and ask if y'all had any concerns. But otherwise, this would be the approval of the request. All right. Good deal. Thank you very much. That's all we have on that.
Item 2 is the contribution rate, regulation 60.
Make a motion we approve.
We have a motion to approve the contribution rate, which is by statute what will take place July 1 at 18.4. Do we have a second?
Second. I missed the motion.
Dr. McCoy made the motion. Ms. Hanover, second. Any other discussion? All in favor, by aye. Any opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you. That's the most efficient agenda item I have recommended in a while. And thank y'all for that. The next item is actuarial experience study and recommendation. I'm going to ask Ed Coble with CAVMAC to make his way up, and perhaps Darby as well. And just to remind you, this is to go over the actuarial experience study recommendations. And the requested action for today is to approve the reports as well as the recommendations within those reports. Of course, CAVMAC is here to present and go through those again and answer any questions you have. So again, requesting approval of the reports and the recommendations within that they'll use for the upcoming valuation and other endeavors. But it's the same information and the same reports that were presented in the last meeting. And with that, I'll turn it over to CAVMAC.
All right, great. Thanks, Ray. Yeah, we're just here to kind of give you just a summary just before you do the vote to approve those actuarial recommendations. So this really is just, a summary of what we did presented in April. As part of the experience study, we do a full review of all the actuarial methods that go into funding for a pension plan, including the actuarial cost method, the asset smoothing method, and how the amortization is used for unfunded accrued liability. We're all comfortable with those methods that are currently in place, and so we recommended no change there. The economic assumptions consist of inflation and the investment rate of return. We looked at the future inflation expectations for multiple sources. They all are really close to the current assumption of 2.4%. Some are higher, some are lower. So we feel real comfortable with maintaining the current assumption of 2.4 as well. So we made that recommendation. The investment rate of return, we've lowered periodically over the last few years, and we've reached what we feel is a very reasonable assumption at 7% going forward for the outlook. We did look at different breakdowns of real rates of return back in April for Callan's capital market assumption and the Horizon survey, which we currently do. So they all were just slightly at or above 7%. So again, we feel real comfortable. I'm sure Callan has presented their results to you as well in the past few meetings, but we feel comfortable right now that the 7% is reasonable. The median return for all plans that are in the NASRA public fund survey is still around 6.9%. So Mississippi PERS is right in the middle of those returns assumptions as well for your peers. So again, putting those together, we're recommending no change from our current assumptions. As far as the demographic, and this is where the actuaries spend most of their time looking at historical gain and loss and what happens to the people, the demographics over the last 4 years. This is actually a new slide. We didn't present this in April, but I kind of wanted to show you what we saw over the last 4 years as far as demographic gain and loss. So this has the 5 main components of what we look at as far as what happens to people. We have salary, mortality, retirement, withdrawal, and disability across the top of this graph. And the middle of this graph is at 0, meaning that that means there's no gain or loss. Basically, the expectations that we expected based on our assumptions were very close to what actually happened. So if the bar is right around or hovering near 0, that means the assumptions are pretty good, and the gain and loss is not as volatile. You'll notice over the last 3 years, we've got 4 years here, 21, 22, 23, and 24, for the 4 bars for each of these 5 demographic changes. You can see what we've been talking about over the past few valuations is the large salary increases that have been provided to PERS active members. And you can see the impacts of those losses to the liabilities. We've talked about that, when salaries are given that are more than expected, they hit the liabilities right away. But in the back end, for the future years with higher payroll and a contribution rate, a statutory rate, it means more dollars are coming in to the plan in the back end. So it kind of funds for itself in the next 20, 30 years or so. But it hits the liability all at once because it's impacting future benefit payments. So we've shown these, all these numbers are from the last 4 evaluations, but kind of wanted to put it in a picture form for you all to see the magnitude of these changes. You can see the mortality, we've had a gain in all 4 years. After the impact of COVID, you know, we had a bigger impact of a gain for mortality in 21. It makes perfect sense with what we, you know, saw as part of the pandemic. But when you look at them in magnitude of those salary losses, it's rather small. Same thing with retirement. Retirement, we had basically 2 years of small little gains, and then 1 year of a loss in 1 year. We can't even see the line on the graph. And then we've had 4 years of withdrawal losses. So that was one of the big things that we looked at. And so the next slide is the exact same numbers, but I've taken out salaries, the salary impact, just to show you those lines in more of magnitude, to show you these 4 components. And you can see, you know, overall, we're talking, you know, for the majority of these are within $100 million of gain or loss, which when you're talking about a $60 billion fund, it's not a large, or it's not a big expectation to see volatility like this. We consider this, especially the retirement, that we've pretty much, the assumptions are working really well with what we're actually expecting. Again, the withdrawal numbers were a concern to us, and we made adjustments in those numbers, which I'll kind of give a summary of. So for all 3 systems, we did make minor adjustments to our retirement decrements, but they were very minor. For PERS, for Highway Safety Patrol, we did increase. We saw a lot more retirements over this period, so we did increase. But for the legislative plan, we actually decreased during the election year. For termination, we're actually decreasing the rates. When we see losses like that, that means there aren't as many withdrawals happening at PERS than anticipated. So we're actually decreasing the rate, which does come with a slight cost to PERS. So what we're doing is we're trying to offset some of that loss that we see each year and build that into our liabilities up front. That's when we do by decreasing. For Highway Patrol, it was the exact opposite. We're actually increasing the rate. We saw a lot more terminations from the Highway Safety Patrol than we did. And then for...
Ed,
yes.
what is it? Explain that decrease during election year. What? Explain that.
Yeah, so what we saw, so we have rates for the legislative plan separate for an election year, and then we have separate rates for a non-election year. Now, during a non-election year, there's not a lot of movement. There's not a lot of retirements. There's not a lot of withdrawals unless somebody chooses to, you know, just retire during their term. It doesn't happen very often, but we do have an assumption for that. But we have a larger assumption for the number of withdrawals and the number of retirements that happen during an election year. Because, you know, somebody could lose. They're not making the decision to retire or withdraw. Sometimes it's due to the election. So we saw a lot less movement during the election year that happened in the last 4 years, where more people, you know, won or stayed on as a legislator. A disability, and we didn't really make much change for, you know, really the decrease for PERS is very minor. Even though the salaries did show losses for PERS and the other systems, we decided to leave it alone for now. We think things will return to the norm. We're starting to see that already in our 2025 valuations for some plans, including teachers' plans that have not provided large salary increases this year. So we think we're pretty right on in going back to more of a 3% on average return for active members. And then for the mortality, we made a minor adjustments. We're currently using the most up-to-date mortality table that was available when we did the report. There has been a new mortality introduced within the past month after the experience study came out. But to be honest, there weren't much differences between those two mortality tables. They still have public sector data only. So we feel real comfortable with using that mortality table. And we'll look at the new mortality table during the next study. So those were our demographic assumption recommendations for y'all. And then these next 3 slides just show the impact. We broke down PERS just so you could see what the impact would be for each of the 5 basically changes, or 4 changes, and then everything all together, what it would do to the unfunded. But overall, if you look at the first column there, that's the 2024 valuation that we presented in December. And then after all the changes, what we're seeing is actually a reduction in liability when we make all these recommendations and put them all together. The funded ratio is just slightly increased, and the contribution rate is slightly lower than our expectations from the 2024 valuation. So overall, the recommendations were very positive to PERS. For Highway Patrol, we're meeting with them tomorrow. So we'll go over these results with the administrative board there. They had a slight increase in their unfunded due to the recommendations and a decrease. But it actually, with the change in withdrawal rates, it actually lowered their ADEC contribution recommendation just slightly. It's about 20 basis points. And then for the legislative plan, we saw similar to PERS, we saw a decrease in liability, an increase in the funded ratio, and a decrease in the ADEC rate. So that's pretty much a summary, quick summary of what we discussed in April. And I'll leave it back, hand it back to you for approval.
Can you, excuse me, one
Of course.
question. Can you clarify for me, these numbers are based on the 6/30/24
Yes, sir.
numbers?
That's right.
Do any of these calculations include the impacts of Tier 5?
They do not.
Okay, so all of this was based on prior Tier 4, all of that information. That's where this comes from.
Yeah, there's no projections in the projected funded ratios in the bottom row.
Yeah.
Are just based on what we knew as of June 30th of 2024. So it does not have any of the new tier stuff in there when we did these projections.
Experience is a fancy actuarial term for actuals.
Yeah. Yeah, we're comparing what actually happened versus what we assumed to happen. That's basically what we're doing here. Good summary. Should have started that off.
Any questions?
Just
Yes, sir.
curiosity on the withdrawal. Can you kind of define what you mean with withdrawal? Because that, it's $300-400 million over that 4-year period. What are we seeing that we didn't expect?
So, so when we look at withdrawal, it's again very hard to predict. That's probably one of the hardest things to predict. But withdrawals are folks that leave PERS or one of the other systems before retirement. So they could be 2 years of service in and decide to leave. They could be forced to leave, if they're not performing adequately, they could be fired. It's kind of those things, but it's anybody who leaves the system either, again, not vested or vested before they reach retirement eligibility. So we have an assumption in there that's, for PERS, we think is very detailed because there's a lot of withdrawals in the first few years of service. You know, if somebody comes into PERS, you know, we just see the numbers show that there's a lot of movement in those first few years. But then, obviously, once somebody gets to, say, 10, 15 years, they're older, they're closer to retirement, there's not a lot of withdrawals. So we have a very detailed, and it's in our back of our report, but a very detailed probabilities of when people will withdraw from PERS and again, the other systems for each age and service category. So we're kind of tracking these people, and we started this 2 years ago. So this was kind of an update to that table. So, so it's harder to predict, but we're hoping with the newer table that we're kind of hopefully going to see the withdrawal losses shrink closer to zero.
And so a withdrawal, is that defined as withdrew, left employment, and asked for a full refund?
No, not necessarily. They can leave, we don't distinguish whether they leave their money with PERS or not. It's just somebody who leaves PERS before retirement. So they can leave their money with PERS, and that's considered a withdrawal as well.
Okay.
They're not withdrawing their money, they're just withdrawing from PERS.
Okay, because
Yeah.
the withdrawal of their money would have a different actuarial impact on the system,
Right.
because when I withdraw, yet I'm not vested, it is uncertain whether I will ever return to draw a retirement or withdraw, but, okay.
And just know, sorry to, just know that if they withdraw or terminate, and they leave their money with PERS, we keep a liability for that individual on the records until that money is paid out. If they come back, then we have a built-in liability for them when they come back already and they just continue on. So we're not, you know, putting their account to zero. And so this way we're keeping that volatility down, because there are a lot of people that do come back to PERS for sure.
And then the salary increases, that was just greater than the expectation or the actuarial assumption, but that appears to be over the last 3 years about a $1.3 or $4 billion hit to the liability, and that seems counterintuitive a lot of times to people, but I appreciate that you pointed out that the raise forces us to put the liability on the books today, even though the benefit of higher wages, i.e. higher employer contributions, will be felt over the lifetime of the employee. Is that fair?
Yeah, exactly right. And, you know, salaries define what the benefits are going to be in the future. I mean, this is a final average earnings formula, right? Whether it's the tier 4, you know, 2% multiplier, it's based on what your salaries are. So if you give big salary increases to that higher than expected to a 25-year-old, that's just going to keep growing till they reach retirement. So the liability hits all today, but we're going to get the funding in the future for it.
So in a situation like that, the state potentially would be better off to put more money toward insurance or more money toward an employee's benefit that is not geared toward PERS, because that would have no impact on the future liability as it relates to their retirement.
I don't want to answer that.
Okay. Well, would this be
I won't
true?
speculate on that.
Would this be accurate, though? Because I want to make sure, maybe from the policymaking standpoint, we could defer to the policymakers, but if it has nothing to do with the PERS benefit and nothing to do with salaries, then it shouldn't have an impact on PERS liability.
Yeah, it's just hitting the salaries would have the impact on the benefits.
And then the last thing, you're, I guess, adopting a new mortality table.
Well, yeah.
That appears to be about a $1.2 billion hit. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the mortality table is the base. See, when the Society of Actuaries comes up with a mortality table that encompasses all public sector folks across the country. What we do as the actuaries is we look at your data from Mississippi and we kind of adjust that table we changed, they're basically Qs. It's a probability of death for each age, for genders, for each age. So, but what we do is look at Mississippi, and you're different than the average of the rest of the country. So we make adjustments to those Qs. That's what we're doing here. And we're making slight modifications to those Qs because it's anticipated that people are going to live longer in the future. And you made it through COVID with really, there wasn't a lot of gains in the system. So there wasn't a lot of COVID deaths compared to other states here.
And that's what I was understanding, if they can go back to the next slide that actually shows the numbers.
Yeah.
Because if I look at the mortality change, am I reading that correctly, that you're comparing that back to the 2024 valuation? So just the changes that you're adopting in mortality, which means people are living longer, is a $1.6 billion hit right now.
That's right.
When they adopt it.
That's right.
And then your net, we actually go down just a little bit in the liability.
Right, because
with all the other changes.
retirement kind of offsets that change to the mortality table, the adjustments to the mortality table.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I want to follow up on Dr. McCoy's mention of Tier 5.
Total salary?
If memory serves me, I think I made the motion for us to refer that recommendation to the legislature, and it basically has been passed. But I hear negatively from particular law enforcement that our action or our recommendation will hinder and make it more difficult to hire law enforcement because of the changes in what Tier 5 does. Do you have any thoughts on, does our action negatively affect that profession of law enforcement and the hiring of it in the future?
So I'm assuming you're saying law enforcement within PERS. Because,
That's correct.
Because there's been no Tier 5 for the Highway Safety Patrol. So it's just the law enforcement that are in PERS. Gosh, that's a hard, it's not an actuarial question, but it's a hard,
I thought y'all could answer anything.
Yeah, I try. I'll try to put my other hats on. But, the Tier 5 is a lower benefit structure than Tier 4. That's
What kind of percentage is that, lower than what the current Tier 4 is?
we've looked at it, but yeah.
From memory, I mean, it's the same information or materially the same information that was presented previously to the board, and the actuarial slide decks or various letters with a couple of minor changes in the actual passage of the legislation, which from memory, I think were two items. One was the 35 and out provision, which is certainly member friendly, and then the inclusion of the military time. The remainder of that is be the same or similar to what was analyzed before. And of course, this is a recap of the Tier 5 versus Tier 4 difference. As you probably know, the multiplier is a 1% multiplier on the DB side.
So the new employee is going to get about 30% less in retirement.
We'd have to go back and
Than
look at the
current
slides
Tier
and
4.
the information.
Isn't that approximately right?
I don't recall what those numbers were, but it's
And of course,
probably somewhere, well,
it
it depends.
It'll depend on what their defined.
It'll depend on their
contribution
investments.
is.
It's
That's right.
exactly right. It does depend on the defined contribution side of things and how well they invest that portion of their money. They could, do well in the market and get a better benefit in their for
And it's
their
also gonna be-
retirement.
That's a part of the total compensation package.
That's right.
And a new hire is gonna have to look at that total compensation package and make the determination of whether that's good for me or bad for me or whatever else, and not really something that we can say it's bad for new hires or good for new hires. They're gonna look at a total compensation. It is one part, just like the health insurance is part of the compensation package, any other benefit that the city or the county gives, and any salary that they pay, and that's gonna make a determination of whether they can hire somebody or can't. I don't think there's gonna be any one thing that says, I'm not gonna go to work for Lee County. It's gonna be, I wanna see the package, and that's gonna make the determination, I think.
Well, in Mississippi,
All of those are unknowns, and I agree with that. However, the examples that you gave us
Yeah.
was about 30% difference.
Yeah, it sounds about right.
I mean, that's what I saw, and that's the only thing I had to go by. It's about 30%. Now, I will answer another way, in that we don't have any data that would say that hiring a new employee is gonna be more difficult. I'm getting the same phone calls. In fact, the first phone call I got was, well, why isn't law enforcement in PERS, just like the Highway Safety Patrol, we're doing essentially the same function, and the Highway Safety Patrol can retire with full benefits and then go to work for the city police and get another retirement package. Why aren't we like that? So I am getting other issues, and that's the reason I see that some of our local law enforcement want to get on with the highway patrol. They can get a state retirement, get full retirement, or whatever they do at 25 years, and then they can go get another retirement. So I'm getting some of the same questions.
well, all I hear from is the Clinton Police Department,
Yes.
which is y'all have passed something that's gonna make it more difficult for us to hire a Clinton policeman. Now, I'm not gonna try to wiggle and say, well, I didn't do that. I did, and I support it and still do. But how bad have what our actions caused it for Clinton to hire new policemen after next July? I don't know.
I think that's
And
another
nobody's
thing
answered that yet.
I think that's another thing that we're gonna have to monitor in some manner.
I don't think it's something you can answer, like Dr. McCoy said, without the data. It's just someone saying it's gonna be hard. But you have nothing proven that it's gonna be harder for you to hire anyone.
And
That
I'll
is
also
something-
say, we are not the employer. Our responsibility is to the fund and to the current employees and the current retirees. We're not, the employer is going to have to be the one to make that call and make that decision. This board doesn't have the authority to set what the retirement, what any of those benefits are. And that's gonna be the employer, if there are problems, are gonna have to make that known to the ultimate employer, which is the legislature. It's not our responsibility is to the current folks. And there aren't any tier fives involved, right?
Absolutely.
So to the point that this board should be concerned about, that difference, whether it's 30% or 50% reduction, where does that funding go? That reduction?
So that reduction in benefits for Tier 5 will change the future projection of benefit payments out many years into the future, and that will help the funding of PERS reach 100% funded ratio, estimated to be 14 years faster than if everybody stayed in Tier 4. Thank you.
And, you know, you mentioned that this is the first time that we have ever had Social Security included. We were given a benefit package, and in the past, we've only been concerned about what our retirement system is and nothing from Social Security. And personally, I object to including that. And now that we've got the defined contribution, I don't think that ought to be included anymore because we have no responsibility with it whatsoever. I think it only ought to be the defined benefit because that's what we're dealing with. And we've always, since we only had the defined benefit, that was what our concern was. Can a person live on our retirement? And now the state, through adopting the Tier 5, has shifted the majority of the responsibility of the retirement to the employee. So I object, quite honestly, for having that whole package together because we can't control what's on part of that package. It's just a estimate, just a guess out there with a defined benefit. We know. I mean, that's what we do. But anyway, that's just an aside. That's just my thoughts personally.
And back to our point at hand, which is the
I'd make a motion to
the
approve the
proposed
experience.
changes. We have a motion and a second to approve the experience studies.
Just to clarify, that include the recommendations and everything?
Wait a minute, now, what are we voting on?
The experience study.
The
that was just
experience
presented.
study, just the
Okay,
experience
okay,
study that we
okay.
just had. The experience study and the motion, I assume, is experience study and any recommendations involved with it. We have a motion and a second. Do we have any other discussion there?
I would just say that these numbers to me are what they are. I mean, they're factual, looking at it. So I'm going to vote in favor of it. Yes.
All in favor, by aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Ed and Darby, thank you. The next item is the board travel authorization is behind tab G. You can see the handout there. This is something the board typically does, and usually annually, just going through and considering and presenting and approving board travel and training opportunities. This is similar to years past, and as you can see behind tab G, it's conferences, trainings, or meetings of the following: NCTR, NASRA, CAP, which is part of the International Foundation of Employee Benefit Plans, CALEN, and any other actuarial training as needed. So again, just would present that for your review, consideration, and approval, similar to the way the committee and board has done in the past. I'd be happy to answer any questions, or if you choose to add anything, just talking about board member travel.
Any questions? Any discussion? Do we have a motion to approve the travel for 26?
So move.
Second. Have a motion and a second. Any other discussion? All in favor, by
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. And that brings us down to the update on Tier 5.
Thank you. And the last item here, Tier 5 update. Now, you should have a handout in your notebook. It may not be in the tab. It should be in the back. That looks similar to this. It's just a one-page, high-level outline handout that should be, like I said, in the back of your notebook. And I have this here just to, from a high level, to guide in some of my remarks as far as an update. First, the top half or the top section is an attempt to focus on what I'll refer to as board level items. The board items where the actual board action and a vote would be considered, similar to what we talked about in the past. The first one, as far as and of course, those four include the third-party administrator or record keeper, the plan document, the investment lineup, and then any regulations. Those are those four areas. And I appreciate your approval of Empower as the initial record keeper and third-party administrator. And we've talked with them and are working with them. And for all intents and purposes, the contract/amendment is ready to be signed, and we anticipate that coming and being finished in the very near future. So that's going well. And as far as the plan document, which is certainly a very key item and will be a heavy lift, work is underway on that. And as you see here, the tentative timeline is to have that ready for the board in October, possibly in August, but want to definitely emphasize and mention the tentative plan for the October board meeting, referring to the regularly scheduled meetings, of course. Again, work's underway internally with our in-house counsel and others, and with Ice Miller, and that'll be a very key document that we'll use to govern the plan, similar to the way ORP has a plan document. The next item is the initial investment lineup. That again, that work is underway on that as well with our investment team and others. Again, the tentative plan here is to have that.
Excuse me. Who are the and others?
Callan, I think it's been mainly internal staff for now, but when I say others, I would say PERS individuals, Callan, Empower, people like that.
Okay, when you do that, I'd like a more complete list of who we consulted for the investment lineup.
Oh, sure. Or how I usually do it is who's recommended it or who is recommending it, but happy to do that. But the work on bringing forward to the board the investment lineup is underway, and tentatively have that scheduled, assuming this is all agreeable with the board, for October, maybe earlier, but want to mention October. And I suspect that it's a little premature, but I suspect that the initial recommendation for the investment lineup will be real similar to the existing MDC, but the review and consideration is still underway. And then as far as the regulations, I would say between now and February, basically, with a lot of it being around October and December, most likely. The regulations, I don't believe will be as heavy a lift. The heavy lift is in the plan document, and the regulations, just generally speaking, will be going through those and bringing the ones that are needed to update where applicable, kind of like we did in the last couple of days or in this set of meetings, to where we've updated the ORP plan document and the regulation for changes in state law. We'll be doing the same thing with any regulations that apply, but in many ways, it'll probably be similar to what's in the plan document, and we'll be bringing those forward as needed for the board. And as far as should I pause for any discussion or questions there before I go to those? Those are the board level items.
On that, the regulations updated, I'd like to ask the question of Bill, because he represents counties and the cities and maybe the other representatives here of the groups. The regulations, if they're done in December or later, how much lead time do the agencies and others need for their IT people to deal with their programs and payroll and deductions and all of that sort of thing?
We're starting now.
Do what now?
We're starting now.
Okay. I mean, but if you don't have the regulations, you don't precisely know what you got to write in there, correct?
Have the law.
Yeah.
Okay. So I was just wondering if there was going to be enough time for the finalization of the regulations that we do for the agencies and all to implement.
And I think the regulations, to some extent, regulations are more about timing of when you need to get something where and when you do. Like Dr. Rutledge said, we know what the law says and how we're going to have to structure a new hire in March to do, so they can begin working on that now. The regulation is going to be more about when do I have to turn in the money to the state and that type of thing. I think is more along the lines of what those regulations are going to tell me.
Sure, all of the above. Let me just say kind of what was intended by this here. The regulations will largely be just updating for what's already in the law. But very importantly, I put this here in the mindset of when we be bringing things to the board so you all would know for planning or to get any feedback that you had. But we won't wait till February or whatever to communicate with employers. We'll probably have some initial communication going out after the start of the fiscal year. And then once the plan document and investment line up, once those kind of things are coming together, we'll be communicating with the employers. So this was really intended just talking about when you all could expect regulations coming to the board, but the details of what employers, in addition to the law that's already law, but as far as our working with them or communicating with them, won't wait for that, if that helps at all.
I would like to keep in mind that, from my perspective at least, it would be nice to know of anything that isn't in the law specifically, but you think that there needs to be some operational piece that then the regulations would be the
vehicle
bridge between those two.
Sure.
So that would be important to me, because obviously PERS is pretty good about, and I kind of question this at times, because if the law didn't change often, then the regulation typically here has mocked a code, basically comes back, and the trick is to make sure that's no different.
Sure.
But then there are always these gaps, right, in questions in operation that the statute may not take care of, or it needs interpretation, and of course, these regulations would be that, I would think.
Sure, we can certainly do that, and Devette, if you will, help remind me to point that out as we do the parts that may be doing exactly what you say, which does happen from time to time in regulation that's used to clarify, and we can do similar things with the plan document. And that's probably where most of it would be explained, but yes, we're doing that.
The earlier that we can get those regulations out, even the proposed, I don't object to, because this is going to be such a huge implementation, I personally do not object to the proposed regulations coming to us and going to the employers, because that's gonna stimulate the questions of the gaps of what I see. In other words, on that first one, under implementation items, project team, see, personally, for all the different groups we have, superintendents know about public schools. And if they know that, they're gonna know where those gaps are. So how do we include, that group, the state agencies? Do we keep it just to our staff and send it out and wait on them to do it? Or are we proactive in approaching those groups formally to ask about that implementation and to make it seamless? Because I don't want it to get to March 1st, hire somebody, and then they get that first paycheck and, oh gee, we just don't know how to deal with that.
Well,
And I don't know any other, I'm speaking about process stuff that I don't really know now. I'm so far removed, but I just know that the closer they are to the implementation, the better the question is going to be.
well, generally, we'll definitely appreciate the question and feedback, and we can, we have some of that in mind to, I think, alleviate and address already, and we're happy to change some things. As far as the regulations, we'll work to just have those as soon as possible and along with the plan document and everything. We should be able to do that as far as that preliminary one or the initial one that you're talking about. So we'll just aim and work to do that together or close together. And if y'all are agreeable, we could always have a quick additional whether it's quick or not, I'm not sure, but additional meetings or special meetings. And we'll work to do that. And we should be able to. If for some reason we can't, I'll circle back with you. To the broader aspects of what you're talking about, if I understood you right, and I won't go into too much detail now, but we definitely plan to have a communication and outreach plan to the employers, and we'll be starting that in the near future and certainly well in advance of implementation, and having training, and I mean, all sorts of things I was gonna cover a little bit later in here, but definitely we'll be doing that. You pointed it, Ms. Lee, probably. Yeah, sure.
I just wanted to say, we are already getting the questions from employers. Mason's employer reporting team and Lisa's customer service and retirement education team, they're getting tons of questions on specific details, which are really helping us to formulate these documents. So we're already getting feedback from employers. And just for reference, the reason we hear the regs twice is because after the first filing, there is opportunity for public comment. You'll remember, we've only really had that one time since I've been here, and that was when the question about reemployment in the legislature, but we received many letters of public comment during that time. So that's why we hear it twice, is if we have public comment, there's opportunity for the board to take that into consideration. So we're gonna follow all those rules. We're hearing feedback and questions. There's a new question or a new thought just about every day. So we are trying to engage with employers. They're engaging with us. So we're trying to, get ahead of some of that. And this process already allows for time for an amendment between the two filings.
As you get those questions and they come in periodically, if you would update with the board, I think that we're receiving questions like this and we're working on that. As we get telephone calls, I think it would help us if we already knew what those questions were. And we could say, well, I just got a printout from PERS administration, and they're working on these right now. So just be on the lookout for stuff coming. But in this transition, I think communication is of utmost important, especially for the questions that we're going to get.
Well, certainly we'll do that, and that's a good segue into parts. I'll just kind of jump down more toward the bottom, but we'll absolutely be happy to do that, and we'll do that. And one of the things that we have done, and you may or may not have seen it, and it's in the early stages, but it's a Tier 5 website or a Tier 5 link as a repository within the PERS website to put all things Tier 5, if you will. And it's in the early stages, but so far we've got House Bill 1 out there. We've got a quick summary out there. We have the one-page benefit overview that compares Tier 4 and Tier 5 that you all saw previously, and we appreciate your complimentary feedback. That's out there. And then we've started an FAQ, a frequently asked questions, just like y'all were talking about, that has a good many, and we'll be adding to that. So it's, again, a little bit in the early stages, but we have several, and we have more, and we'll be referring employers and others to that. And it sounds like that'd be something, and we'll still keep the board and board members apprised, but that you all could review and you all could refer them to But we certainly will keep keep all of you informed, and that's what we intend to use as part of it for that. Think that'd be a good idea, and certainly welcome any feedback that y'all have and you have. And like Ms. Lee said, and others, we're already getting a lot of questions, and we'll be continuing to communicate with them more. If it's okay, I'll go ahead and move down the outline if that works for now. So just picking up kind of more to the operational part and as opposed to the board level items, we've certainly got a project team established and still refining that. Also Empower, once given the go-ahead, which will be soon, I think they're ready to go. They'll be establishing their own project management implementation type team, and we'll work collectively together on that from the DB and the PERS side, and also the Empower for the defined contribution side of the hybrid. The initial programming efforts are underway. And then kind of like we've already talked about, a lot of the essential communication will take place after the plan document and the investment lineup is finalized. We're not going to wait until October to begin some initial outreach, but as far as some of the key things, communicating those very important factors will happen after they're approved. The item I have as far as the estimated new entrant, and of course CAVMAC is here beside me to explain it, that's really just an information item. In looking at some of this and trying to estimate the next few years of Tier 5 for various reasons, we had CAVMAC look at the new entrant profile and show what that was. And in looking at that information, which is basically predicated on actuarial information, from memory, I would say that you could estimate 14 or 15,000 new hires with an average salary of a little over 37,000 and growing. And then over a 5-year period, with consideration of the various withdrawal rates, it gets to around 37, 38,000. I think that's probably close to right. Just wanted to provide that as background. Of course, that's just an estimate. So we'll see, but I thought that might be of interest to you. I already mentioned the Tier 5 website and link and those things, so happy to expand on that further or answer any questions you have. The last one has to do with Tier 4 eligibility. And we've had a few questions around the Tier 4 versus Tier 5 or the timing of things like that and eligibility. I know some of you have received questions. I know Dr. McCoy had received some questions. And would you like to share some thoughts on that first, or is it okay if I just go ahead and go through?
Yeah, I go ahead and
Okay.
just mention that. Now, as a board member, let me just say, I would say, I've had a ton of questions about that. Now, in board speak, that's 5.
Yeah, okay.
Okay? That's just kind of the way that is. That's the way my board members spoke to me.
Yeah.
But the question is on a Tier 4, if they start and contribute to PERS under Tier 4 and their employment is ended in some manner, and a year from now they come back, are they still under Tier 4? Now, I know that we have regulations that speak to that. In these frequently asked questions, it needs to be referred to those specific places in our regulations and in the law, and that sort of thing. But there's multiple issues. Now, I'm speaking, and I'll just be honest, more from an educator standpoint and what happened in my business. Bus drivers, very fluid. They'll come to work saying, I'm going to work all year, and they'll start and they'll put their money in, and then they'll stop. And then they'll come back next year and they'll do it another while and they'll put money in and then they'll stop. You know, one of the questions is, well, was that a permanent employee when they began, or was that just a part-time? Well, they started off wanting to be full-time, but then it stopped, and next year, well, I think I can try it again. They're going to put an 8 on there this year and I'll do it again. You know, I mean, those sorts of things, how long and who makes the determination of whether it is a full-time position or a part-time position or a not qualified position. So,
Sure.
I mean, that's the kind of question that I'm getting. And I'll give you one other, for instance, that was explained to me. Person is going to graduate from college next year, let's say next May. If they wait and get a teaching contract in May, they'll be in Tier 5. but they want to be in tier 4. So they're going to start, and their commute to school, and they're going to sign up as bus driver. Right now, morning and afternoon route, full-time, they get health insurance, they'll be in tier 4. They start putting it in. Okay, they get ready to do their student teaching, they can't do that, so they have to stop. They intended to work, but it just didn't work out. So when they come back in the fall as a teacher, are they in tier 4, or were they considered not employed long enough? I mean, that's the kind of real life question I think that could occur in
I'm glad to speak to that as what the law says, because we passed a law that clearly said you are the tier of which you're hired unless you take a full refund. So you can come up with 37 scenarios the day you're hired. If you're tier 3 and you leave and come back 20 years later, if you didn't take a full refund, you're tier 3. If you're tier 4, if you hired in as janitorial services, bus driver, doesn't matter what the job is, and later you become a school teacher or even a superintendent, you're the same tier. So that's a question that may be out there, but there is no confusion as the author of the bill that tiers 1 through 4 keep their status, their benefit, leave, whatever that they accrued the day they were hired. Now, if legal has a different opinion of that, I'll be glad to listen to it, but that is what was written into the law. That's what I explained from the floor in committee on numerous occasions. So there is not a scenario in my mind that someone was hired prior to March 1st, 2026, that they will not be the tier of which they were hired the day they were hired unless they take a full refund, which means they're no longer a member of PERS, and they would rejoin PERS in whatever tier was in place at the time.
Thank you. I was hoping that you would speak to that, Senator, in the sense that some of our regulations may sound differently from what you just espoused. I had to call cousin Billy McCoy one time to get him to explain the law versus the regulation. So I'm glad to hear that.
I'm gonna talk to, when ready, I'm gonna mention.
I think that just needs to be, thank you, Senator Sparks, I appreciate that.
And I think the question is more, not really a tier 4 to tier 5, it's a question you have in any tier, it's whether or not that person is hired full-time or not full-time. Is that not?
Well, part-time for creditable service is full-time,
Yeah,
but less than part-time is not.
that's right. I think that's.
You cannot get credit.
Yeah.
So it really is a position, it's a positioning issue, and there are some pieces that limit that. 10 hours a week is not gonna get you there.
Well,
Yeah, but in general, again, all the things you can predict and say, you try to regulate and say this position, you have to have some intent that this is not just a spun up position for 2 weeks so you can get paid so you can get tier 4. That is not the intent. So some of that may be expanded on it, but it does not negate the fact that if I come in, except for maybe teachers, most employees are day to day. This contract going day to day. I don't have to stay here. If I come in and I contribute and then I decide this is not for me, I'm quitting. Well, if I've got a contribution that came PERS, as the senator said, I'm thinking I'm good. I'm in that tier as long as I don't refund. But once I refund, I'm done.
Okay. Yeah, we have jailers the same way. We have jailers who we hire, who the intent is they're gonna be there. And that first weekend when they come in the drunk tank and they get thrown up on and cussed at and spit on and whatever, next week they're gone. And we've paid them as if they're a full-time employee, but they ain't coming back to the jail. They may show up somewhere else in PERS, but they ain't coming back to work in the jail. So with those kind of things, the intent when you hire them, you hire them as a full-time employee. It's what they may become, maybe something else.
Well, let me try to speak to some of this, and thank you all for that. Now, as you know, there's a lot that's been covered throughout there or that could potentially be related to that. One, I would just like to say first, going back a little bit, Dr. McCoy, I appreciate your clarification that a ton of questions were just 5. Because that matches up kind of with the way we get it. So I'm glad to hear that. Still a very important question. And the senator, of course, is right on the law. You know, basically, you've got if you're in if you have PERS membership, prior to tier 5, then unless you refund, you still you go back to that. I think a lot of this may be referring to is more about the eligibility requirements for PERS. And when tier 5 is implemented versus tier 4, the eligibility for PERS was not changed. That's all the same. And I'm going to give a little overview and cover that. I think will speak to a lot of what you talked about. Now with the dialogue, I may not remember every aspect, but it'll hopefully give a little bit of context around that. And then certainly if I were to say something that's materially incorrect, I'd ask the staff behind me, whichever one, to make sure and jump in. And of course, if you get in a certain level of detail, I'll refer to them, because a lot of times it may depend, it's all outlined in regulation, if not in statute. And it sometimes can depend on the type of position or the year they were hired, or just depends on what you're looking at. But generally speaking, and in some ways specifically speaking, the eligibility requirements, again, haven't changed. But you need to make sure that it's subject to either law or regulation, existing law or regulation, that really not to do with tier 5, that you're in a covered PERS position. And I'm gonna try to touch on a few things that y'all sprinkled in with the questions or comments. Make sure you're in a covered position from a covered employer. And you're basically an employee for all intents and purposes, things like tax status and benefits and things of that nature, and your regular and periodic compensation, things like that. And your employment the reg says, anticipated to exceed 4.5 months. It says exactly that, or something to that effect. And then there's regulations about that, and then there's regulations about earned compensation, what's included and what's not included. And there also is a regulation, because some of you mentioned some of this, about student and part-time workers. And of course, we can outline or share the reg, but in short, students and paid interns and student part-time workers are not included. But that's the same. That's been the same for years. That's the same irrespective of tier 5. That's all kind of falls under eligibility. So what'll be important is for the employer, as well as the potential member, but the employer to make sure and report that correctly and properly, and for us to monitor it.
I understand what you're saying,
Yeah.
but we've heard from the author of the bill, all of that has to be tempered with what the author said. You get a paycheck, you pay in tier 4, you come back, you're in tier 4. We've got to temper that, because I can see us sitting on a claims committee and they say, I worked and I submitted, and the eligibility requirements here says that I'm not eligible, yet the author of the bill said, if you are paid and the money comes in under tier 4, then that claim is going to come to me. Now, if I'm sitting on the claims committee and I've heard the author of the bill speak one way, and we've got things that are in conflict, so we need to work to try to minimize those conflicts about that.
Well, I'll go back to the video and see what I said. The good thing is they're recorded now, so they could do that. But I stand on what I said, but I have never said that I'm determining eligibility. I taught as an adjunct professor at Ole Miss, and I only had one class a semester. Now, if I could have got a second class, I could have gotten insurance, and I could have been in PERS. And then I was a public defender in the city of Oxford for 3 years as a 1099 employee. Had I been an employee, I could have been in PERS. So that is 5 years of credible service that I'm not going to come before this board and say, y'all should add that to my years, because I wasn't eligible. So I will clarify my statement. Based on the eligibility rules that exist in the PERS community, if you're an eligible PERS employee into tier whatever it is before 5, you will stay in that tier unless you take a full refund. So I'm not trying to muddy the water. I'm trying to be very clear, because I hope people do watch these hearings, because I don't want someone to think I'm not going to come back into state employment or I'm going to make any decision because I don't think I'll have the same privilege or right. I will stand behind the fact that we have no intent to change any privilege, right, benefit, credit for anyone that's tier 1 through 4 as determined by their hiring date based on the rules and regulations established by PERS.
And if I understand that correctly, that reconciles with what I was saying or explaining.
Yeah, so if there's a regulation that says employers should anticipate that 4.5 months minimum is this position's hiring, then if that regulation isn't sideways with a statute of some sort, then that regulation's the next tier down from the statute as far as if an employer shows up here for a claims committee, Dr. McCoy, I would think, again, take out all the nuance that could be presented in that. If it's clear that this employer's testifying in that hearing, that no, they didn't anticipate it was gonna be 4.5 months. It was only 2 months. It was a summer job, July and August, that was it. Well, then they're probably gonna get mowed down. And they're probably not gonna be eligible because the regulation said it had to be anticipated. Now, is that employer probably gonna do that? You can guess, but there's a lot of anticipating 4.5 months. Again, just because they anticipate it doesn't mean somebody doesn't still get hired into it, and they quit after 2 weeks and they still contribute and they're still in there.
And we have the same thing. We hire somebody for the road crew. We anticipate their being there. We also hire people to cut the grass in the summer, and we know they're not going to be there. They're there for the summer, and we don't put them on PERS, and we shouldn't start in order to try to get them into tier 4. So we know on our side, we know what the intent, whether they're going to be there, whether the intent's for them to be a permanent employee or not, whether they wind up being there 2 days or whatever you have to say, then get paid their end.
Sure. No, thank you for that. And I think it can be summarized, and I think and Senator Sparks said some of this in his second set of comments, is that Tier 5 didn't change eligibility, or it was not the intent there. And certainly, if we are administering a reg or updating a reg and we see that it's in conflict with statute, then we would propose to change it. Back to those regs and the update, but it is important, though, that employers know that, even though it's the existing regulation. And it will be important that folks that are reported to us, like it always is, should be appropriate and proper. And that would be Tier 4 or Tier 5. And it's going to be important as Tier 5 goes live that individuals are in the right one. For a variety of reasons, it always should be, but especially once the hybrid aspect gets in there. Because if you're supposed to be in Tier 5, as you know, a large part of that is the defined contribution with your investment. So it'd be important to have things in there. So we're going to communicate on that and follow that and put some additional time and effort on that. As far as regulations, just for your information, and I'd be happy to go through a high level with this and use the key senior staff when needed, but it's a Regulation 36, Regulation 37, and Regulation 65. Those are kind of 3 main ones that has to do with covered employment and student workers and earned compensation. And we have, in response to some of the questions, and Dr. McCoy and others reaching out, we've reminded employers about that, and we'll continue to do so. And we're going to do some additional monitoring and account reviews of those hired in a certain time frame. And then again, certainly as Tier 5 and when Tier 5 goes live, we'll be doing that, and all of this will be part of our training. And with that, since you all had some dialogue, I may have said a few other things, but since you all had a good dialogue there, I'll just pause. And I'm happy to go back over any of that, but I'll just pause for questions or discussion.
I think Dr. McCoy has some questions, but it might take a little longer. Does anybody need a break?
I need a short break.
Okay. Let's take about 5 minutes.
Yeah, that'd be good. That'd be good.
All right. Thank you.
Okay.
And I guess you're going to mute the mics.
A leave question.
That sounds good, and let me, so we're getting back, so we got everything back on and up and running, everything? So thank you, and, happy to question.
Okay,
He called me the other day.
under tier 5, there is no leave that can be applied toward, eligibility. I mean, for.
Service credit,
Service
yeah.
time, service credit. In the school business, now I've been away from it for 14 years now, so Jay's gonna have to clarify for me, but we, in my district, we had 10 days. 7 of those were sick days, 2 of them were professional days, 1 was a personal use day, but at the end, any that you didn't use could be forwarded, for credit. So now that's not gonna happen. I know really nothing about state or cities or counties or how that works, but I understand that there's personal leave and there's sick days as well.
We only get 34.5 days at the top tier, so.
Oh,
a year.
okay. So none of that's gonna be able to go forward toward, so the question then becomes, are all the laws that currently deal with that pertinent still? And with the strict interpretation of those, are we going to, and you can only pay
30 days.
30 days?
That's right.
And is that a contract rate?
That's
I mean,
whatever their salary rate is.
whatever their salary
Whatever their
is.
rate.
Employee's discretion.
Jay, what do they get paid?
In school districts, it's substitute pay rate.
Substitute pay, not contract daily rate. I mean, a teacher may be making $250 a day or something like that, but they can only get, what, 100, whatever it is,
$70.
whatever the substitute rate is. So there's some serious differences in what the law allows to do that. So it appears to me that inadvertently we may be penalizing employees for coming to work. So the question for me is, how do we deal with that? Because what's going to happen is they're either going to use their leave or they're going to lose it. And they're going to have to do it within that current year. So the question then for me is, well, if they call in sick but they're not sick, is that fraud? And of course, I know that you don't have to bring a doctor's note. Most have policies about that. You don't have to do anything for several days or whatever. So my question is, has any thought been given to how to resolve that? And teachers now, if teachers want to, they can donate part of their leave to people that have catastrophic illness. Jay, is that correct? They can donate their leave over to people with catastrophic. So I'm just wondering how all that's going to be integrated into. It just seems to me that there's going to be some issues there.
Again, I would say that's gonna be the employer's problem and not ours on that. That's gonna have to be an employer issue.
And
And each agency is gonna have to deal with it, and each county and city and whatever is gonna have to deal with however that's handled.
Dr. McCoy, we have that situation somewhat now with ORP.
Okay.
They don't have service credit, so when those ORP participants retire, they retire with pretty large leave balances, and it's forfeited beyond that 30 days that's paid out. So we do that every day.
And I think the important part is, again, to clarify, this is not touching anyone in tier 1 through 4.
That's
Their
correct.
service credit rules continue. So it is a yet to be hired person who is yet not negotiated to be employed, who would be told on the front end, 30 days is all we can pay you as it relates to leave. Govern yourself accordingly. I don't think that would address any transfer. I'm very familiar with teachers who are some of the most benevolent people in the world, giving leave time to people who have a major medical situation. I don't think that violates the new rules because it's used. It's unused leave was the issue. And correct me if I'm wrong on this, if someone came in and had 2 years of a combination of leave it bumps up their retirement by whichever percentage they're in, 2% or 2.5% if they're over the 25 or 30-year benchmark. And that's going to raise your total retirement, if it's a 2-year issue and you're in the 2.5%, by 5% total of your high 4. Who paid an employer contribution on those 2 years? The answer is no one. Who paid an employee contribution on those 2 years? The answer is no one. That is why using the leave to raise your retirement was problematic to the system, and I assume actuarially problematic if you add years of service credit, but neither the employer portion nor the employee portion was paid because you simply submitted it. Now, I do appreciate in your report the average amount of leave that an employee has appears to be 0.57 years. So since we're several years away from any Tier 5 retirement, I certainly don't have a problem with looking at it if it's a legislative matter to look at the 30 days and whether that number should be higher. Should that be 90 days or maybe up to 6 months? But you do actuarially have to take into consideration that would bump your pay in your final year by half a year. Plus, you would have to get the valuation of those days in some calculation. But I don't think that's a huge issue because it's over an 8-year period now. So that was the intent. It was certainly not to take anything away from anyone who's already earned it, but it's also something that will be known on the front end. And I have no problem, and I'd like to hear from employers if they think that that's a good way to handle it. If paying out more than 30 days would be beneficial, I would certainly entertain that as a policy person.
Well, I just don't want to see us get to the end. Oh, and the teachers are all contracted, legally contracted. So what about those days are legally theirs? You know, I mean, when they sign that contract, that there's, so that it is, I don't want the school districts to get into a situation, and again, it's the employer, I don't want them to get into a situation where they're writing into the contract something that is not allowable by law. For instance, let's just say the school district hires a superintendent, and they put in there that any unused leave, we're going to pay you at the daily rate for that. I mean, are superintendents covered under that? I mean, they're not going to turn it in anywhere. They're just going to get a bump in the salary at the end. They're going to get, they may get paid for it and not reported to PERS. I mean, I don't know precisely how all that works, but I was never fortunate enough to be smart enough to negotiate a contract like that. But that happens out there, some of that sort of thing. So I just think that as you are looking at the issues, because there are some contracted employees that are in PERS and there are a lot of at-will employees, those may be different under some contractual issues. So I just have that concerns. But I am like Bill, I do think that's an employer issue more than our issue. But we represent the employees, and they're going to be asking about it. So I just think that we need to, in the vacation part, that's going to need to be a special look at for contracted employees. I do believe. Jay, was there anything that came out of your thought or your superintendents that you associate with that questions have come forward about vacation for the Tier 5, or have you had any questions about that?
I've not had any questions. I would just make reference to a teacher's contract does not stipulate the amount of days that they get in terms of leave time, sick time, or personal time. Their contract just stipulates the amount of work days. So that's the only side point I would make there. And of course, superintendent contracts are totally different. Do have some contracts out there that do reference vacation days, but in a school district, the only individuals who get vacation days are those who work the entire year. We refer to them typically as 240-day employees. But those vacation days are not written into a contract either. Only the superintendent would have vacation days written into a contract.
The other thing, and I want to make sure it was clear, is we're talking about 30 days to pay out. It's not that you accumulate more than 30 days, you know, if you're at year 10 or 12 of employment, you don't have to use or lose it at that point. We're talking about when you get ready to contemplate retirement. And the other thing as it relates, since we're talking about tier 5, this is where the issue is. The good thing is we allowed for an optional variable contribution from the employer so that if I had leave days and I wanted to go ahead and retire, I could negotiate with my employer to say, well, go ahead and make a contribution that's optional and variable into my DC, and you actually balance the thing out. I don't know that that would violate the 30-day rule as far as how many days can be paid out, because that's a separate contribution. But those are the type of things as we move through, you know, we'll try to find solutions to problems.
Well, it's a perfect lead into my next point was the contribution by the employer. And that is one option that could be available. The other is if it's added on the DC side, and if it's a contracted employee, it just seemed, in my mind, it was always, if I ever added it to a teacher's contract, then the teachers thought it was there forever. Or is there a way, and this again is the employer problem, to keep the employer from messing up with contracts? Can you write separate contracts that deal with the DC side, and this year I can make a contribution, and that's a year-to-year thing? That question has come to me. And also, what about the IRS regulations where you can't treat one employee differently from other employees with, I don't know, healthcare or whatever that is? So is this covered under that particular part when you start making DC contributions?
What I would say is, to the extent it's applicable to PERS and PERS implementation and administration of the Tier 5, where needed, those sorts of things will be contemplated in the plan document, and we'll be prepared to discuss that further as we bring that forward to the board, as y'all review it and approve it. If I'm understanding you right, that, again, where needed or where applicable to us, it would be in the plan document.
Okay, the last thing that I have, and it's just a few minutes, I would just want to cover in my mind with the board about how we got to the Tier 5. And I do need to ask Ed. Ed, last October, you made a recommendation, CAVMAC recommended to the board that the legislature considering the full ADEC of 25.9% or the FCR by 2% each year up to 27.9%. And that was going to, at full implementation, be $600 million a year, as I recall, and as I checked.
Those rates.
The estimated 600 million may be something we did internally, but go ahead.
Yeah, the rates that you quoted are right. I'm not sure about the 600 million.
Yeah, and just for background, that was, as you've seen, that was an estimated number based on moving to those rates and stuff. Yeah.
Okay. That's all we ever get is an estimated rate, 600 million. So, I mean, that's what I took. So, with that, that has not changed at this point. I mean, well, it will change in the, I mean, the next time the ADEC has not been met. We have a Tier 5, we have no additional funds. So we're not paying down any of the debt.
Not debt.
At this point, and the Tier 5 that we currently have, it'll take at least 40 years, 30 years, or maybe it's 25 before it starts moving just a little bit.
Right.
So we haven't done anything in my mind to guarantee that retirees and actives are going to get their payment, because that debt is what's owed to them, not future employees. That's what's currently owed. So we still don't have from the legislature any additional funds to take care of that debt. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. In October, in that same meeting now, that we
I
had
wouldn't
in
I
October.
hate to interject, I wouldn't necessarily word some of that the same way, but.
Well, I know you
Yeah.
wouldn't, but you're a little timid in my mind, so I would just go with my conjecture
Well,
at
I'll
this
keep that.
point.
All right.
In that same meeting, we saw the hybrid, introduced, and in that particular meeting, it was 5% to the DB plan and 4% to the DC plan. And we also saw the 1%, per year, the eligibility ages, no COLA, no, lump sum payout, also a potential match by the employer, and vesting is at 25% each year for the potential employer for the first 4 years. Now, that's what we saw in what was proposed at that time for us to look at. Then we come back in a special meeting in November the 19th, and the average compensation was changed to the 8 highest consecutive years. Then it was also changed from a 5% in the DB to a 4% in the DB. No employer match was spoken of, and that vesting then would become 100% immediately in a DC plan. So there was a pretty significant change from the October meeting to the November meeting. Now, my question is, Ray, who did you meet with to come up with these changes to give to Ed?
I'd be happy to answer that. That was a very long question, though. Could you unpack and maybe specify which particular parts you're looking for? And I do want to go back to clarification on the other part, because I was certainly in support of and in agreement where I think you were going to go about additional funding. But there are a few things just to clarify I do want to come back to and share just to reflect what reflect things. But if you could specify which part you want.
Any way you want to, just go.
But if you'll specify which part you want answered, I'll try to answer it.
Well,
Maybe a shorter question.
okay, the shorter question. Who did you consult to change the structure of the hybrid plan from October to November?
October to November. Now, so I'm not sure if exactly the exact time frame or the exact details, but as you know, I have, I'll give background later. Not sure the exact timing or the exact details, but are you referring to the change in the contribution between 4% and 5%, that flip? Is that mainly what you're talking about?
I'm referring to all of it. So the question is, why, I'll go with that. Why did you change from 4 to 5?
Well, to go back to your broader one, I'm happy to talk about all of it, but I was trying to
That's
specify
fine.
what you
Go
were
ahead
talking
and
about.
talk about that.
But the 4 and 5, based on my recollection, during a lot of the working meetings throughout the fall, which included Senate leadership, and I'm going to be more specific about that in just a second, but in Senate leadership and with the board chairman and the board vice chairman and others, and some of the working dialogue. But if I remember correctly, the change from the 5 to the 4 came out of a working discussion with the lieutenant governor and the chairman of the board, if I remember correctly.
Who are the and others? I'm just trying to get it clear, because it was never just clearly stated and put on video as to whom you were working with to come up with these numbers to give to Ed to do. So who are the and others? You mentioned chairman, vice chairman, yourself, the lieutenant governor, and Senate leadership. And then you said and others.
Sure. Well, that covers a great deal of it. I'll try to unpack that in more detail. But first, I want to say that one thing you said in there and that I don't know is totally accurate, or certainly could leave one with the wrong impression. As far, because I think I've been very transparent, clear, and consistent with my various recommendations or updates, oftentimes in here. And I may come back to one part of that, especially about November and an update that was there. But to try to give you the information, and I think you already know this, but staff, consultants, board members, Senate leadership,
Other board members,
board officers,
other than the chairman and the vice chairman.
Perhaps, I can't remember exactly, certainly would happy to. But I will say this, I'll tell you one thing that's I think we'll just do this. This goes back to the maybe leaving one with the wrong impression. And if the board or any board members or designees want to speak, I don't want to take your time. But I would say, as you know, we've studied Tier 5 for a long time. Analyzed Tier 5, I've made recommendations about Tier 5. And a couple years ago, or a couple sessions ago, the board passed a motion that directed me to develop a Tier 5. And then, of course, we come forward and we went through a lot of analysis, and I think even had some preliminary recommendations of a choice between a reduced DB and a hybrid. And the board voted, I think, on a preliminary basis to approve that. And then after that, there was a recommendation for a board-approved Tier 5, which was a 100% pure DB. It made minimal changes to the existing plan. And that gets us to, I guess, session before last. No, I think I'm going to give you an overview. That gets us to session before last, right? And then at the conclusion of last session, in the law that was passed, the legislature actually put in there the intent to develop a Tier 5. So moving forward from that and going forward with that, starting, I guess, in the late spring, at some point after session, we started to follow up, work with legislative leaders that were interested, work with board members, staff, consultants, whomever, including yourself, as Tier 5 was back on the table, if you will, and as board members reached out to me. There were several from time to time, you being one of them, that we should have our recommendation or we should review it or so on and so forth. So that began a working process to develop different alternatives. And I think in October, we had a meeting with the board that gave, I believe it from memory, it had a hybrid on there along with other options in October. And that hybrid was very similar to what was eventually passed. And then in November, we did that again, and I think that was based on some board input that had some different DB alternatives. Now, keep in mind, I am going from memory, but if I remember right, we even had names for them because Chairman Breland had a suggestion, Treasurer McCray had a suggestion. You maybe had one or bought into theirs, so we had different alternatives in November, which included the hybrid. And from memory, I believe that hybrid in November was the same, or I'm about 90-something% sure it was the exact same ones that came in December. And then, of course, in December was the one that was the hybrid that the board endorsed. But to some of your comments, one thing I think is very important is in the November update that I just described, somewhere in there, either in the presentation with Ed or with the actuaries or whatnot, hold on just a second, too.
While you're doing
no,
that,
hold, if you don't mind, I want to finish this train of thought, and I don't want to be too timid about explaining my answer. But in that November meeting, as I was saying, somewhere either in that update that Ed provided that same hybrid that a month later, roughly, the board considered, which we came in here in a very open, transparent, scheduled meeting and presented it and made recommendations, and the actuary presented the actuarial part, and the board vetted it thoroughly and had a great deal of discussion, and then the board voted. But in November, somewhere back to that, very important to some of your comments earlier, when in November, either during the actuarial update or afterwards, in some of my comments, I gave an update to the board. And I want to read verbatim from a copy of the November minutes that were printed off the website. And they live out there to this day. And it says at the end, this is the signed minutes, upcoming legislative session. Higgins presented the board with an update on a recent Senate leadership meeting about the possible Tier 5. Now, just as background for those who may not know, the Lieutenant Governor is the President of the Senate, as well as presented additional information with revised scenarios and a hybrid option for their discussion and review. While no action was taken, the board had an in-depth discussion about the need for a new tier. Higgins, while not presenting a recommendation, encouraged the board to think how they feel about a hybrid should state leadership. And on that, as many of you know, but as for others watching, of course, the change the law requires a legislative action. There are two chambers. The Senate is one half of that. The Lieutenant Governor is the leader of that. And as I understand the status and the nature of Mississippi state government, one could say that that position is arguably one of the most influential policy positions. But back to the minutes. Had an in-depth discussion about the need for a new tier. Higgins, while not presenting a recommendation, encouraged the board to think of how they feel about a hybrid option should state leadership want to pursue a hybrid. He said that while the board's obligation is to the trust, The state and employer responsibility is to develop the plan. He gave the example that if the hybrid reflected better sustainability of PERS and helped pay down unfunded liability while creating less risk, supporting such a new tier might be good. And so some of the things about that you're implying or alluding to or innuendo, I think it's very unfortunate that, that in many ways, I think it's unfortunate that we're having this discussion in this particular way, in this particular
Well, let
forum.
me
But
ask
but some of the
this
things
way.
you were applying earlier, I don't think
Tell-
they're necessarily
tell-
accurate or tell the whole story.
Let's finish that story. How many times did you meet with House leadership?
Several times over my
wait,
career, you've got to specify the time frame, which I'd be happy to answer that or any other questions.
I'm gonna say from October to December, how many times did you meet with them and their leadership and come up with their input into what a Tier 5 might look like?
Without gathering my thoughts and memory more so, answering on the fly like that, just a little qualifier, I could be not remembering something, but during that time frame of the fall, it was primarily, if not exclusively, on the Senate side. And in fact, in some of those conversations, it was indicated that the Senate would be taking the lead on the reform discussions.
Mr. Chairman,
So during that time, you elevated the Senate leadership over the House leadership?
No,
by
absolutely not.
Not including them?
No,
Well,
sir, no, sir.
It appears because what we have is a Senate, and that's what we voted on and that's what we adopted. So I don't.
Mr. Chairman.
I can't say from memory, at one time, there was a meeting with the speaker, with the director, Mr. Breland, and me. And the speaker's comment was basically, what do you all think of the House, of the Senate plan? And he did not offer any modifications, suggestions. It was just basically, what do you think? Because I believe there was some difficulty in arranging meetings with the House side at that point, because I think their position was, we're gonna let it come from that side. But anyhow, I do know there was a meeting, I can recall a meeting that the three of us met with the speaker on that, but there was no input from the speaker as to any changes, modifications, or whatever. It was basically, we know the Tier 5's over there, and Kelly may have a different.
And that's correct, and thank you for that, Mr. Benson. But just to mention, I did meet with the speaker the previous spring, and certainly would meet anytime.
Yeah, I certainly don't want to cut short any individual members' inquiries that they have, but as I normally am, I'm a little lost on where we are on the agenda exactly. I'm having a hard time following.
If you'll allow me about 3 more minutes, I'll be done.
I certainly don't want to cut you short, but I am a little confused what the inquiry is
The
about.
confusion is, for me, and it was confusing as I went back and looked at all of this, is I felt as if the board was not fully informed of the meeting and the negotiations that were going on. I felt like that at the end, we had a Senate proposal, and on the December information that we were given, it said potential state-sponsored hybrid plan. And when I looked at that, and I'm hearing what I've heard since, it appeared that this was a Senate hybrid plan.
Again, my question was, where are we on the agenda and how does this pertain to us actually implementing Tier 5?
Yeah, well, I just asked for the ability to speak here, is what happened, since we were talking about Tier 5. So it was my opinion that we elevated the Senate to a place to have more input to the board. We're talking about individuals that have no fiduciary responsibility whatsoever to give input. Changing the 4% to the 5% and the 5% to the 4%, I think that was purely to put more responsibility on the employees for their retirement. Also, this data that we got didn't come in until 10 o'clock before we started our meeting, and we didn't have time to do it. And yet at the conclusion of that meeting, we had a motion that was brought by our director here, and it said that we should endorse whatever they did, and I strenuously objected to that. at that time, I had been told that there were meetings going on. I'll freely admit that. I was not given the specifics of the meeting, just that in one instance that a motion that what the lieutenant governor wanted this board to do was not oppose whatever they did. When we got the motion, it said that we would endorse it. I did not feel as if, and still do not feel as if that motion came from here. I feel as if that motion didn't come from the board. It came from the executive director that we endorse something that we had not see. So I just think that this is Randy McCoy. Our funding policy said that we would do our best to keep a DB policy. And our executive director did not do that. He brought this hybrid. That was the motion. He did not give an option that gave that hybrid. And I tried to get an emergency meeting or a special call meeting, and it was delayed. Information was hard for me to get because, and I think that just my opinion, and again, this is, Mr. Higgins and I have had this conversation primarily before, but I felt as if that what was happening to me was the Senate was driving our motion. The board was not driving it. The Senate was. That specifically the lieutenant governor. And I felt as if that if we're going to be open, every board member here needs to know, especially on things like this, when the executive director is meeting and changing things, he needs to tell us. Tell us if we have to go into an executive session, that's great. If not, I just I just feel as if Ray, in this particular, I have a much higher expectation of communication from our executive director to the board members with the specificity of the things that are going on. Others may disagree with that, but for him to bring basically what the lieutenant governor said he wanted here, and that's the option, and we didn't do a DB plan, and I presented one that was good, and then we were told if we sent that over as an option that it would confuse the legislature. So I just want it to be clear that that anytime the state agency, lieutenant governor, speaker recommends to us, just say it. Just say it here in public. Put it on video. That is what's going on. I just want us to be open and transparent totally. Of course, we have a tier 5. I'm going to work with that tier 5 as hard as I can. But now we don't have any authority to raise contribution rates, none whatsoever.
Mr. Chairman, I want to comment when we get a chance.
Do what?
I'd like to reply since the majority of it's dealing with my work.
Sure.
First of all, the lieutenant governor, before he was lieutenant governor, was the managing partner of Phelps Dunbar and was one of the best tax attorneys in the United States of America. So his opinion's probably a reasonable opinion to listen to. Second issue is, and I had to learn this the hard way, that building across the street doesn't run on ideas. It runs on votes. So whatever you want to hypothesize and pontificate and believe is the best pathway to go, if it boils down to legislation, we got to have something we can pass. Now, my friends from the House are not here today, and I don't want to play these games between the House and the Senate that get played so often in the media, but I think you answered your own question in that the House didn't bring forth any legislation this year. The year before, the Senate brought forth ORP legislation. They brought forth NPL legislation. They brought forth 2 or 3 pieces of legislation from this board, and the House brought forth HB 1590. So it's interesting that you're elevating them when HB 1590 would have blown this bore up. So what we did is actually look at the problem. This ox was in the ditch before I got elected.
I've
It
heard,
was
I've
20
heard that speech about that, and I agree
Well,
with you.
it's 20 billion, and then decisions of this board made it 6 more billion based on actuary recommendations to go from 7.75 to 7, to shorten the amortization period. What y'all just voted on. Added 1.2, I made that point, changing the mortality tables. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm saying that's real, is that adds 1.2 billion, which does what to the ADEC? It raises the ADEC. If that goes up. Now, the ADEC fell 0.3 of a point, if I remember correctly, in our last meeting. But the fact of legislation came from the Senate side is simply because I felt like this was something we had to deal with. Now, the fact that there's no new money, I think, is actually an inaccurate statement, because we're adding 36 million a year roughly when we add a half a point. So that's $180 million. That's part of the 600 million. Of course, that's a moving target.
Before we leave that ORP, I want to ask for that documentation to see that, because I know it will be
Well, I'm not
trending.
talking about ORP. I'm talking about 2.5% we added. A
Oh,
half
okay.
a point on 7.2 billion is about 37 billion. Times 5 is $180 million. That's part of the 600 million that's been asked for. The legislature put $110 million in 2024. I can't find another time the legislature ever put any money in it. I tried to put 500 million in this year. This system needs more money. And we'll go back to that ORP chart that you're talking about, because I firmly believe if you put $500 million into the system, and you think we're going to make 7%, but actually what was the number today? 9.34, 9.84 from yesterday. That's 35 million to 40 million. That's growing exponentially. That is new revenue if a lump sum is infused. That same lieutenant governor carried multiple funding streams to leadership on the other side, and nothing got funded because of blow-ups in the legislature, which is pathetic and ridiculous. But we do believe that there needs to be a funding stream, but funding without reform, the $100 million that was in HB1 was literally taken from the lottery. It was taken from MDOT, and it was taken from the educational enhancement funds. And then you and your retirees and your members were going to be taxed 1.5% more on sales tax, and their gas tax was going to go up twice as much as it's going up. So I am committed to have streams of revenue. I am committed to try to have lump sum that creates a future stream, because I don't know what a future legislature would do. But as it relates to the Tier 5 and what was done, I walked by one day and just happened to walk through the Capitol, and the lieutenant governor said, "You want to come in here? We're going to talk about this Tier 5. So once the determination was made that we were going to try to go toward a Tier 5 with a hybrid, the tweaks that were within it, I mean, we were putting pen to paper in the middle of the session, and I was very involved in that part of it. We were working with the actuaries. We were working with the executive director. We're working with the legal team. We're working with members of the board to try to get it right. But ultimately, as I understood, the recommendation was, if the legislature chose to pursue a Tier 5 hybrid that had an actuarially positive impact on the plan, which or the people you have fiduciary duty to, we believe the board should support such plan. I believe 1.89% was the final number that is the actual
And
lower cost.
who asked for the change in the words from endorse, not to oppose to endorse? Is that the lieutenant governor?
Yeah, I'm not sure on that, because I wasn't in the conversation. I think you might be referring to you and Mr. Benson. I do want to come back to some of the things you said that I'm going to cover in five. But I will say this, the endorse generally was the word I chose in trying to figure out how to consider all things that I should and bring it to the board, if I remember correctly. And I certainly stand by drafting that and helping y'all
But what
consider
you
it.
did not bring to the board was the DB plan.
So I don't think that's accurate. And if it's okay, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to go ahead and speak to some of those things, just more broadly to what you said. One, let me just say that, I want to, work with you and communicate with you and the board and meet the needs and preferences that y'all want. I mean, no question about that. So there's always room for improvement, and I want to do that. But I think This is all very unfortunate. I think some of the things you said, unfortunate. I think the forum is unfortunate. And otherwise, I would certainly be content to be quiet or say less, but I do feel compelled to say a few things. One being, I've often said, in some various way, very transparently and consistently, is we need pension reform and we need additional funding, which I've done that. I've said that. I've also said many times that we should all work together, that we as fiduciaries should work together with the legislators and their leadership as policymakers. I've said that. Also along the way, now and otherwise. And I've stayed quiet many, many times, but I feel like today I need to comment. You've either said, implied, or had some insinuation or innuendo about maybe something was not proper or not appropriate. And I don't believe that's the case at all. I think everything that I've done, meeting with legislators or legislative leadership, is very appropriate. In this case, which I'm going to expand on more in a minute, it was done often with the chairman and the vice chairman. And I don't want to speak for them, but I think what they did was very appropriate. I think that's what we should do. Leaders should work together, us as fiduciaries, them as policymakers. The part that you said just now and earlier, I don't think it's either inaccurate, out of context, or certainly could leave people with the wrong impression, because we did, in addition to the multiple years and multiple discussions and whatnot, we provided options in October. We provided them in November. It included a hybrid, but it included others. And I even remember back in the fall, somewhere in there, I think you and Mr. Benson had talked about other options, and I think you and I talked about other options. So to say we didn't bring it, I don't believe that's definitely leaving people with the wrong impression. Now, on the December day of that vote, there was a comparison of two for clarity, because we'd spent the 2 months before with the different options. But I just don't think that definitely at a minimum can leave people with the wrong impression. Back to you say a lot there, and so I'm trying to remember it and come back with all the continuing dialogue about the lieutenant governor part. The other thing too about the night before, and part of the reason that was is because the discussion was after the investment committee that day. And you mentioned about communicating with the board and bringing it to the board and so forth. Well, I think it's important to remember that I know that each individual board member, and I know each individual one has a vote and opinion and whatnot, but in addition to what I think very much working within the scope of my duties, which I'm very thankful and honored to have, I had the existing current board chairman and board vice chairman with me in most of those meetings. And the vice chairman, of course, is the longest serving active board member, with me in those meetings. And in fact, after that started, the leadership would contact them as well. So the part about me not informing the board or not communicating the board, I think that leaves out a lot of context and could give people the wrong impression as far as not knowing about the lieutenant governor. My recollection, I think it's unfortunate you feel that way, but I think my understanding, belief, and recollection is everybody was informed on that the night before. I believe the lieutenant governor contacted a few of you. I think Mr. Benson talked to you and Miss Hannah, and I called the rest of you, and there was some overlap. And then scores back to the most important thing is in December, and I've been making recommendations with all due respect long before we've been talking together, working together, analyzing options, analyzing recommendations, and making recommendations just from memory long before the lieutenant governor, at least in this context, and perhaps even before Senator Sparks was Senator Sparks. So that's just unfortunate. And getting back to the December and your comments about transparency and doing it, again, we had a very open, transparent meeting where we came in here and I made a recommendation. Ed presented it. The board vetted it thoroughly and then voted in a overwhelming way in a certain way. So I just think I think it's unfortunate you feel that way. I think it's unfortunate that this dialogue is occurring in some ways in this forum, but I felt like I needed to comment on that. I don't know that paints the whole
I will
picture.
just say one thing, and this is my last thing. What was presented to us on December, the 18th meeting, was the lieutenant governor's hybrid plan, per se. And and once it was determined that this was the thing that he was going to introduce in the Senate, there was no DB plan that was presented to the board that would approximate this. And it took me almost, it took me a while to do it. So there was not a DB plan, and I am, again, like you, it's unfortunate this conversation had to occur in open session. But I think that open and transparency has a different definition from you than it does to me, and communication with the board. We have voted, we've got a tier 5, but the way we got there, I think, was not open and transparent communication, because you didn't share with the board in open communication that you met with the lieutenant governor, that you did say that you met with him. You read it off the minutes, and I know that it's there, but you didn't go down in the specificity and say, this is what the lieutenant governor said, this is what's showing up here. So I apologize for having to do it this way, but I felt like that it needed to be said in open forum. And as a board member, I expect several things, and I just want to share with the rest of the board what my expectations are. That everything be open and transparent. If the executive director meets with the lieutenant governor or the House, it needs to be reported directly to us what went on and why it went on and how it went on. The second thing is that a request that comes from a board member to the executive director should go to the top of the list. If it has to do with things that's coming from Ed or whatever, it's us. We're making the decision. If we have a request, response needs to go to the top of the list, and it needs to be taken care of first. And there needs to be transparency. And I don't know how to say this. As an executive, I always wanted to know what my staff was going to say to the board, but I always allowed my staff to speak their mind to the board. And then I would say, but the staff has not convinced me. I think it should be this. Now the board has opposing things. So I truly do not like filters between staff that makes recommendation and me, and as a board member. So that's my high expectations, and that's just what I expect going forward. So I'm done with tier 5 now.
I got it.
Y'all, we're gonna work, and we're gonna implement it and try to make it work.
Mr. Chairman,
I
can I
need,
comment just a minute? The legislative leadership did have 2 options, because I told it to them. One of them multiple times, and the other one, I mentioned it to also. It was a tier 5 the year before. They had both options. And if they didn't hear that or weren't listening, then that's on them, not on me. They did have more than one option. And Ray, what is the settler's role in all of this?
fund it. Is that what you're getting at?
Does this board have the obligation or even have the ability or authorization to develop a tier?
No, sir, that's right. That is the responsibility of the state.
That is the settler.
They designed it, yeah.
That is their responsibility, not this board's, period. That is very clear, very clear. So I think we're talking about roles that seem to be a little bit mixed up, in that it was driven from the place that was willing to do it, as the settler was willing to do this. And again, I'll go back to, that's the only willingness I could see in any of it. And they are responsible for that. And I think any effort to get ahead of, in front of, or undermine the tier 5 that has been approved by the legislature, unless it's more reformative, is probably getting in the way of your fiduciary duty, because those people in March, I can't, fiduciary wise, I don't care about those people. I can't, at the expense of the people that are currently in the system. Thank you.
Anything?
Just briefly to the comments about staff, I think that's unfortunate as well. I think that's inaccurate. I think that's leaving out a whole lot of consideration. But as I said on this other topic beforehand, I'd be happy to certainly work with you and meet with you. But I'd raise the question that some of this stuff, I'm wondering if it seems like to me to be more appropriate for an executive session, which I'd be certainly welcome to join in on, and with respect to the board's prerogative. But I just think that's unfortunate and in this forum, and I don't think it's accurate.
I'm sorry.
I'll just add quickly in this forum, I'm unclear why we had this conversation, why this was brought up in this committee in this way. But since it already has, I'll add, at least in my experience as one board member, I feel like Ray was executing his duties in the way I expect and did a good job of it. I think the law that was ultimately passed was in line with options that we have discussed on this board for years. So I don't know how anybody could feel surprised after the frequent and transparent communication that Ray and other staff have had with us for a very long time. My experience was very different than yours, Dr. McCoy.
I apologize for having to stand up, but I got a cramp
Thank
in my
you.
leg.
Thank you,
y'all.
Dr. Ray. Thank you.
Well, I'm much less eloquent, so I won't say much at all, but I would concur with what Dr. Rutledge said.
With that, administrative committee will stand adjourned.
Thank you.